work for the Wildlife Investigations Lab, which is a small group of wildlife veterinarians and environmental scientists. We're headquartered outside of Sacramento, and we're responsible for doing investigations of mortality in wildlife and health surveillance in wildlife. And my part of that is pesticide investigations. And I want to point out now that for the last 3 days, I've listened to projects that were really the sampling was really well thought out and really well planned, and the data was statistically valid, and it was awesome. This is not one of those. So this is just a grab bag of what I've seen in the last couple of years. And so we use this grab bag, and again, it's opportunistic data. It's whatever someone sends us, or let's say we find a fisher, and we haven't looked at a fisher lately, so we look at the fisher. So this is really a grab bag of what I see, and it's going to be broad brushes on what our current pesticide issues are right now. And so we use that information to undergo more intensive, statistically valid studies, but that's not what this is right now. Okay, so I'm going to be going over our last couple years of data. And as I mentioned before, most of our submissions come from wildlife rehabbers, and so typically they're going to be wildlife that die with an unknown cause. And so that could be something like, it might be distemper, it might be neurotoxicant, and we're going to go take a look at that and try and figure out what that is. Mountain lions are not included in this database, and the reason for that is that we got some special federal funding to analyze every mountain lion we can get our hands on a couple years ago, and so we've taken that out of this database. I'm not going to be talking about mountain lions. So over the space of the last couple years, this is 166 pesticide investigations, and the results are that the most common pesticides involved at this point are rodenticides, both anticoagulant rodenticides and bromethalin. And so here's a good place to kind of talk about the evolution of pesticide investigations in the last couple of decades. So when I first started 20-some years ago, your typical pesticide investigation involved agriculture, and it was a big incident. So it was a big fish kill or a couple hundred birds dead on a rice field or something like that. That was the kind of thing that we were dealing with. And the way I would always address that is I'd make 2 phone calls first. I'd call the warden and I would call the ag commissioner. And they would go out and resolve the issue, figure out what had gone wrong to cause that problem. And then there was enforcement action typically that followed, unless it was something that nobody had done anything wrong. And in that case, the commodity groups, the rice industry, for example, was really interested in that situation because they didn't want to lose their tools. They did not want different pesticides to be taken away from them. And so we were all super motivated to look at some best management practices, implement those best management practices, and just solve the problem. And so that's the kind of thing we were dealing with at that point, and typically it was insecticides. At this point, what we're dealing with is residential users more than anything, and so that would either be individuals who are getting things over the counter, or it would be pest control companies that come to your home. The incidents are smaller, so instead of like hundreds of dead birds in a field, we're talking about a dead barn owl or a dead coyote or something like that. So a lot tougher to determine that that is a pesticide exposure. And then instead of insecticides, we're dealing largely with rodenticides. So we're going to talk about rodent problems in residential areas. So let's say you have a rodent problem in your house. And so I'm specifically talking about in your home, so I'm not talking about field rodent problems right now, because those are a little bit trickier. Okay, so you've got a rodent problem in your house, and you decide, okay, I need to solve this problem, and so you go to the store. And there's your section of the store that you're going to be looking at. And so, so what have you got here? Okay, you look on the top shelf, you've got traps. So you've got glue traps, you've got snap traps. Maybe that's the solution you will take. If you don't take that solution, you're going to be looking at a chemical rodenticide. Okay, and so one of those things is an anticoagulant rodenticide. Now, anticoagulant rodenticides can be broken up into 2 different groups. We've got the first generation anticoagulants. Those are the older products. They are what is available over the counter at this point. They are generally less toxic. So when I say generally, there's some overlap. So for example, there are 2nd generation anticoagulants that can be less toxic than certain 1st generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So there's overlap, but in general, the 2nd generation ones are more toxic. and that's why they've had more effect on wildlife and why they're no longer available over the counter. So as of July 2014, regulation was changed in California that pulled those second generation anticoagulants off of the shelf. And so back to your hardware store, when you're looking on the shelf, what you've got available is a first generation anticoagulant, most likely difascinone. And if you want to go with the harder hitting chemicals, you need to hire a pest control professional, and so they would be using either brodifacoum, difethialone, bromadiolone, and difenacoum. The two of those that are the most toxic are brodifacoum and difethialone. And so when I say that there's kind of an overlap, those are the ones that are most toxic. Okay, and so I'm going to be telling you what our data looks like for the last couple of years. And again, I'm not making generalizations that this is what every predator in California looks like. I'm saying the animals that we have gotten into our lab and we have analyzed, this is what we've found. Okay, so in the last couple of years, and I started in July 2015 with my data because that was a year after regulation change. So I feel a little bit more confident that we're seeing the way things look after the regulation change. So 87% of the animals we tested were positive for brodifacoum, 67 positive for bromadiolone, 46 positive for difethialone, and that number for difethialone had come up because that wasn't something that homeowners used a lot, but it was something that pest control companies use more. And I'm sorry I didn't put my difascinone numbers in there, but difascinone is like 20 to 30%, and that definitely increased after the regulation change as well. And my feeling for that is because that's what generally people get over the counter now. So you've got it being used for field rodent control, and now you've also got it used over the counter. Okay, and then another thing that was interesting is that you had multiple anticoagulants per individual. So for those animals that had positive detection, so they've been exposed to anticoagulants, they had an average of 2.3 different anticoagulants per individual. Typically, brodifacoum, bromadiolone, or those are the two that you saw most often. And so 1.8 of those were second generation, and then 0.5 was first generation. So you're still seeing second generations more commonly than you're seeing first generations. Okay, so that's exposure, and most of us who are kind of familiar with this subject know that exposure and intoxication are not the same thing. And a very small, a smaller subset of those that have been exposed will be intoxicated. And so the way we diagnose intoxication is that while we're doing the necropsy, the animal has to show what we call coagulopathy, and that means that the animal has bleeding in its body cavities or under its skin without signs of trauma. So it looks like it bled out, but it didn't, there's no signs of trauma. There's no way of explaining that without an anticoagulant. And so that's how we diagnose intoxication. That's not just we found something, it's that we found something and the animal apparently bled out. Okay, and so there are 23 of those in the last couple of years. And if you kind of look at the list, you can see it's kind of a grab bag. There's some that are obviously secondary exposure. So for example, great horned owls, bobcats, gray foxes probably, turkey vultures. Some of those that are more likely primary exposure, so for example, squirrels. And then some of those that you really don't know because the animal's an omnivore, so for example, ringtail, fisher, fisher's not on there, ringtail bear, that kind of thing. So those guys eat anything, so you're not sure where they got it. So those are the cases that I've had in the last couple of years. Okay, so let's say you say, okay, I have actually heard that anticoagulant rodenticides have issues with non-target wildlife. Not going to use that. So the next thing you might look at on your shelf is bromethalin. Bromethalin is available in a couple different forms. It's for mice, rats, and moles, and you can either get it secured in a bait station, or you can get wax blocks. And the wax blocks, the label says you have to put them in a bait station. Okay, but it's available in both ways, just the blocks or the bait station. Okay, bromethalin is a neurotoxicant, so animals that have been poisoned with bromethalin show neural signs, sometimes incoordination, falling down. Sometimes they do this thing where they're dragging their back legs, seizures sometimes, and this is one of these things. So for example, with anticoagulants, I said you know, you've got a lot of exposure without necessarily intoxication. This is not the same thing. It looks like probably exposure and intoxication occur together. We haven't found anything where that had bromethalin that did not show neural signs in diet. And I'm not saying that that can't happen, but so the way we diagnose bromethalin intoxication is that it shows neural signs, and then we look for bromethalin, and if we find bromethalin, then we call that bromethalin intoxication. And so we've had 7 cases in that time frame, 5 raccoons and 2 gray foxes. So that's not that much, right? However, if Marin County, during that same approximate time space, had 23 skunks and 15 raccoons. So that's just one county in the time that we found 7 in the whole state. Why is that? Is there something special about Marin County? And the answer to that is that there was a wildlife rehab group there called WildCare who had been doing some intensive monitoring and had really been just looking at urban wildlife. And so what that indicates to me is that we're missing this a lot. And so that when you actually get out there and you really check things for it, you're finding this more, which is one of the reasons why I think, yeah, this is actually a problem. And the other thing is that it looks like distemper. So distemper has shows neurological signs, and it's common in gray foxes, raccoons, skunks, same thing with bromethalin. And so all these things that we're thinking are distemper and not bothering to test, some of them are probably bromethalin. Okay, so far it looks like bromethalin intoxication is caused by primary exposure. There's like one lab study that says that that's the way it works, and then that's all we've really found. We haven't found anything that could not be explained by primary exposure. So for example, if we got a bobcat, we would say, that doesn't sound like primary exposure. But so far it's been raccoons, skunks, gray foxes, all of which would eat the bait. And so that's our assumption right now. And so if that is the case, then we could mitigate this situation by only selling bromethalin secured in a tamper-resistant bait station. So if you go back to the hardware shelf and you get rid of the ones that are just bait blocks that are supposed to be put in a bait station but probably aren't being put in a bait station all the time, then you may have solved that problem. And so long-term solutions, let's look back on that shelf. And first of all, in that shelf of pest control products, are there any of those there that cannot cause non-target impacts? And Radex might be, I don't know. We haven't had anything from Radex yet, so I'm giving it the benefit of the doubt right now. But we know that glue traps, snap traps, those cause non-target mortalities, right? We've found things like that. And then we also know that the rodenticides cause non-target mortality. And so this non-target mortality issue is not relegated to just chemical control. The other thing to think about is which of the things on this shelf are long-term solutions? Which of these are you going to be able to use and you're not going to have a rat problem in a couple of months? None of them. So basically, and we all know this here. I'm preaching to the choir here. We all know what the long-term solutions to rodent control in residences are: habitat modification, sanitation, exclusion, best management practices. So if you kind of bring that back to where I started this out, where I talked about back when we had problems with agriculture, and the industry groups would get together with us because they were really interested in preserving these tools, and we would come up with best management practices. They would give those to their growers. And I mean, just a little brag here, but back in the 80s and 90s, we had like insecticides that were so poisonous, and would identify these problems, get together with the industry groups, with the ag commissioners, come up with best management practices. Before they banned these chemicals, we weren't having any problems with them because we were cooperating with the industry groups. So that's kind of what's missing here, is an easy way of doing that. So right now we're dealing with residential users, and we're dealing with pest control companies where there's a whole lot of them, and they're small, so there isn't this easy avenue to communicate with them, to talk about, okay, let's come up with some best management practices, and all of us commit to this and bring down the problems that way. Right now we're missing that. So outreach is challenging. Homeowners are not famous for reading or following the label. Pest ID, all of you guys who do deal with the public at all with wildlife issues, what's your craziest misidentification? I mean, we've got you know, mountain lions that actually turn to be raccoons or bobcats or house cats. I mean, you get all kinds of people misidentifying wildlife. And I don't know how many of you do, we've got a next door website where all the neighbors talk to each other online and complain about this and that. I got involved in a discussion one time where all the neighbors were talking about what pesticide they used to kill skunks. And it was like, you know, so this isn't just like a sporadic thing. This is, you know, your homeowner does not necessarily take the label seriously, so putting something on the label is not the same as changing the situation. And then, so enforcement, so, you know, again, back then we had the enforcement from the Ag Commissioner, we had the enforcement from the warden. Now, if we're gonna send out a warden, we're gonna do it just to scare people because they look tough. But there's never gonna be any, you know, there's not gonna be any consequences. We're just trying to get people to take this stuff seriously. And so basically, there's no enforcement. We can't figure out who did it. If they did it typically out of ignorance. So we don't have that anymore. And then funding. Again, back in the good old days, we had industry groups who were really motivated to solve these problems and would provide money. Now, we know that to identify these problems, and it falls on academia, it falls on the wildlife agencies to come up with this money for themselves, and not really any motivation for the pesticide companies, the industry groups, to take these situations seriously because they're not coming up with any money and they're profiting from dragging it out for as long as they possibly can. Okay, and that's all I've got. Does anyone have any questions?
It is really easy, yeah.
Okay.
There seems to be that there's lots of monitoring going on, like, you know, like Wild Care and, you know, Seth and those guys in National Park Service, you know, we're doing some as well.
Right.
Are you guys ever going to get all that together?
Yeah, I sure hope so. And you know, part of it is like, okay, so let's say National Park Service. So some of that we're waiting for like peer review. So they're going to put out a publication, but of course we all know that that takes a while. What we did back in when we were kind of asking for the ARs to be put into reevaluation is we gave them all our data. And then they also, Department of Pesticide Regulation, also went and collected data from National Park Service and things like that. So everybody, and like the Fisher Project, everybody kind of turned over their data together. So that's, you know, when I do loss reports, they get a copy of, the EPA and Department of Pesticide Regulation get a copy of every loss report I write. So that's being given to them, but yeah, and in a nice, neat package. That's a tough thing because there's, you know, different groups. And we all have our data, and we all kind of, you know.
You can have my data.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Well, kind of, and as you had your the pesticides on the shelf, I was trying to read the prices on that. And I'm kind of curious if there's sort of a price and potency. Like, is it the more you pay for a poison, is it more potent, or is it less potent, more targeted?
You know, I don't have any idea. I don't know if
I think commercially Bromethalin is actually really expensive, but you actually only need small amounts of it. Smaller amounts of it.
Okay, and that's one of the problems that they bring up with securing things in a bait station is that's more expensive.
Sure.
So, yes.
Are you in this study looking at like direct poisoning versus bioaccumulation when you're analyzing?
Right. So for the anticoagulant rodenticides, that's kind of the difference between exposure. So the kind of accumulation. So let's say you get a raccoon and it's got a few different anticoagulants in it. That's can be a snapshot. You don't know when those occurred, so that could have occurred 9 months ago or yesterday. And it could have been 10 exposures, it could have been 1 exposure. So it's really hard to tease that out because all you've got is a number. Yes.
Yeah, going along with what Stella is doing, there's groups of us that are going the legislative route, talking to the California Assembly at the moment. And if your group would like to join on with our effort, or at least be notified about what's happening, please come see me. I'll go to the back after the talk.